The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Arizona Territory as Jake Morrison guided his weathered horse along the familiar trail toward town. His calloused hands gripped the reins loosely, years of ranch work having taught him to conserve energy wherever possible. The small ranch he called home sat on the edge of nowhere, a modest spread of land that barely provided enough to survive, let alone prosper. But it was his, earned through sweat, sacrifice, and more lonely nights than he cared to count. At 32, Jake had resigned himself to a life of solitude. The harsh realities of frontier living had taken their toll on his dreams of family and companionship. His face, weathered by sun and wind, bore the lines of a man who had learned that hope could be as dangerous as it was precious. The cattle market had been particularly cruel this year, and he found himself making the monthly trip to town with barely enough money to cover supplies, let alone anything resembling luxury. As he approached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, the sound of raised voices caught his attention. Near the old mission church, a crowd had gathered, their animated discussions carrying on the morning breeze. Jake's natural curiosity, combined with the rarity of any excitement in their small community, drew him toward the commotion. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, brushing dust from his worn denim shirt before approaching the group. The crowd parted slightly as he moved closer, revealing the source of their agitation. Two young women, clearly sisters, stood with their backs pressed against the mission wall. Their dark hair gleamed in the sunlight, and their distinctive features immediately identified them as Apache. But these were not the traditional Apache women Jake had occasionally encountered during his years on the frontier. These sisters wore simple cotton dresses, their hair neatly braided, and their posture spoke of education and refinement that seemed at odds with the hostile crowd surrounding them. "They don't belong here," shouted Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, her face flushed with indignation. "Apache savages have no business in a Christian town." The irony of her words being spoken outside a house of worship was lost on her as she continued her tirade. "Send them back where they came from before they bring trouble down on all of us." The taller of the two sisters, who appeared to be the elder, stepped forward with remarkable composure. "We are not causing trouble," she said, her English clear and unaccented. "We only seek passage to the reservation where our grandmother lives. We have been walking for 3 days." Her voice carried a dignity that made several members of the crowd shift uncomfortably, though it did nothing to diminish their hostility. Jake found himself studying the young women more closely. The elder sister, perhaps 20 years old, had an air of protectiveness about her as she positioned herself slightly in front of her younger sibling. The younger girl, who couldn't have been more than 17, clutched a small bundle to her chest and kept her eyes downcast, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. Both showed signs of exhaustion and hunger, their clothes dusty from days of travel. 3 days, scoffed Tom Bradley, the local blacksmith. "And what makes you think we'd help a couple of Apache girls? Your people have been nothing but trouble for decent folks trying to make a living out here." His words drew murmurs of agreement from several onlookers, their faces reflecting years of fear and prejudice that ran deeper than any rational thought. The elder sister's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "We have done nothing to harm anyone. We simply ask for directions and perhaps some water before we continue our journey." Her request was reasonable, Jake thought, basic human decency that should have been granted without question. Yet the crowd seemed to grow more agitated rather than sympathetic. "Water!" Mrs. Henderson's voice rose to a near shriek. "You want us to help you? After what your people did to the Patterson family last spring?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, referring to a brutal attack that had left an entire homestead burned and its occupants dead. The fact that the perpetrators had been a rogue band of warriors with no connection to these two young women seemed irrelevant to the gathering mob. Jake felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach as he recognized the dangerous shift in the crowd's mood. He had seen this before, the way fear and hatred could transform ordinary people into something ugly and unpredictable. The sisters seemed to sense it too, their earlier composure beginning to crack as they realized their situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Please," the younger sister spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "We only want to reach our grandmother. She is all the family we have left." Her words carried a heartbreaking vulnerability that should have moved even the hardest heart, but the crowd remained unmoved. "Family," Bradley laughed harshly. Apache don't have families, just packs that hunt together. His crude comment drew more laughter from his supporters, and Jake felt his hands clench into fists. He had never considered himself particularly noble or heroic, but there was something about the sisters' dignity in the face of such hatred that stirred something deep within him. As the crowd pressed closer, Jake caught sight of Sheriff Williams emerging from the general store. For a moment, hope flickered in the elder sister's eyes, but it quickly faded as the lawman's expression revealed his own prejudices. Williams was not an evil man, but he was weak, more concerned with keeping the peace among the town's voting citizens than protecting two Apache girls who had no political value. "Now see here," Williams said, his voice lacking any real authority. "We can't have this kind of disturbance in the middle of town. You girls need to move along before this gets out of hand." His suggestion that the victims of harassment should be the ones to leave was exactly what the crowd wanted to hear, and their approval was evident in their nods and murmurs. The elder sister straightened her shoulders, and Jake could see her struggling to maintain her dignity in the face of such injustice. "Sheriff, we have broken no laws. We simply asked for directions and water. Surely that is not too much to expect from Christian people." Her words carried a quiet reproach that made several townspeople look uncomfortable, though none were willing to speak in her defense. "Look, girl," Williams said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm trying to help you here. These folks are worked up, and if you don't move along, I can't guarantee your safety. Take my advice and head out of town before sunset." The threat was veiled but unmistakable, and the sisters understood that they would find no protection from the law. Jake watched as the younger sister's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as the reality of their situation became clear. The elder sister wrapped a protective arm around her sibling, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. They were alone, exhausted, and far from any help, facing a hostile crowd that saw them as less than human. Something shifted in Jake's chest as he witnessed their quiet desperation. Perhaps it was the memory of his own sister, lost to fever when he was barely 16. Perhaps it was simply the recognition of fundamental injustice that his conscience would not allow him to ignore. Whatever the reason, he found himself stepping forward before his rational mind could stop him. "Sheriff," Jake said, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur, "these ladies are under my protection." The word surprised even him, but once spoken, he felt a strange sense of rightness about them. The crowd turned to stare at him, some recognizing the poor rancher who rarely came to town, others simply curious about this unexpected development. Williams frowned, clearly annoyed by this complication. "Jake Morrison, this is none of your concern. These are Apache girls, and the town wants them gone. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The sheriff's words carried an implicit warning, but Jake had already committed himself to a course of action that he knew would change everything. "I said they're under my protection," Jake repeated, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "That makes it my concern." He moved to stand between the sisters and the crowd, his presence not particularly imposing, but carrying a quiet determination that gave several townspeople pause. Bradley stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "Morrison, you've lost your mind. These are savages, not some lost puppies you can take home." The blacksmith's words were meant to intimidate, but Jake had faced down stampeding cattle and survived winters that would have killed lesser men. He was not easily moved by bluster. "They're human beings asking for basic decency," Jake replied, his voice carrying a firmness that surprised many who knew him as a quiet, keep-to-himself rancher. "And, as far as I can see, they've shown more Christian behavior than anyone else here today." His words struck home, causing several townspeople to look away in shame, though their prejudices remained unchanged. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose shrilly above the murmur. "Jake Morrison, you're making a terrible mistake. Mark my words, no good will come of this. Apache bring nothing but death and destruction wherever they go." Her prediction was delivered with the certainty of someone who had never questioned her own assumptions, and it carried weight with many in the crowd who shared her fears. Jake turned slightly to glance at the sisters, seeing the mixture of hope and disbelief in their eyes. The elder sister met his gaze directly, and he saw intelligence there along with a strength that had somehow survived whatever circumstances had brought them to this moment. The younger sister still clung to her bundle, but her tears had stopped, and she watched him with something approaching wonder. "What's your name?" Jake asked the elder sister quietly, ignoring the continued grumbling of the crowd. "I am Maria," she replied, her voice steady once again. "This is my sister Elena. We are truly grateful for your kindness, but we do not wish to bring trouble upon you." Her words carried genuine concern for his welfare, a consideration that was notably absent from the supposedly Christian townspeople who surrounded them. "Maria and Elena," Jake repeated, cementing their humanity in his mind, and, he hoped, in the minds of anyone listening. "Those are beautiful names, and you won't bring me any trouble I can't handle." His assurance was spoken with more confidence than he actually felt, but something about these young women had awakened a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. The crowd began to disperse somewhat, many realizing that the entertainment was over and their disapproval had been duly noted. But Jake could see the calculating looks in several faces, the quiet conversations that suggested this matter was far from resolved. In a small town like Copper Ridge, news traveled fast, and he knew that his decision would be the subject of much discussion and speculation. Sheriff Williams approached as the crowd thinned. "Jake, I hope you know what you're doing. There are people in this town who won't forget this, and they won't forgive it either." The lawman's warning carried the weight of genuine concern, but also a clear message that Jake could expect no support from official quarters. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Jake replied, though he was far from certain that was true. "I'm doing what any decent person should do when they see others in need." His words sounded more noble than he felt, but they represented a line he had decided to cross, regardless of the consequences. As the last of the crowd melted away, Jake found himself alone with the two sisters outside the mission church. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. It had taken a poor rancher to demonstrate the Christian charity that should have been freely offered by the town's regular churchgoers. The morning sun was climbing higher, and he knew he needed to make some decisions quickly. "You said your grandmother lives on the reservation," Jake said gently. "Which reservation?" He knew there were several in the territory, some closer than others, and the answer would determine how best to help them reach their destination safely. Maria nodded. "San Carlos. We have been traveling from the school in Carlisle, in Pennsylvania. They told us our grandmother was ill, and we were given permission to visit her. But the stage broke down 2 days out of Phoenix, and the driver refused to wait or help us find another way." Her explanation revealed much about their situation. They were educated, had official permission to travel, and had been abandoned by the very people who should have helped them. The mention of Carlisle Industrial School gave Jake pause. He had heard of the place where Native American children were sent to be civilized and educated in white ways. The fact that these sisters had been there explained their refined speech and manner, but it also meant they were caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. Elena spoke up for the first time since their initial encounter. "Maria has been protecting me since we were small children. When the soldiers came to take us to the school, she made sure they took her too, even though she was old enough to refuse." Her words revealed the depth of the bond between the sisters, and explained the fierce protectiveness Jake had observed in Maria's behavior. "San Carlos is a good 4 days' ride from here," Jake said thoughtfully. "Maybe 5 or 6 on foot, and that's if you know the way and don't run into trouble." He was calculating distances and dangers, trying to determine the safest way to help them reach their destination. The reservation was isolated, and the path there led through territory that could be hostile to two young women traveling alone. Maria's shoulders sagged slightly at this information. "We had hoped it would be closer. We have very little money left, and—" She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "We have not eaten since yesterday morning. The store owner in the last town refused to serve us." Her admission revealed both their desperate circumstances and her reluctance to burden him with their problems. Jake felt another surge of anger at the systematic cruelty these young women had faced. They were traveling to see a dying grandmother, armed with official permission and conducting themselves with dignity, yet they had been met with nothing but hostility and rejection. It was a shameful indictment of the society that claimed to represent Christian values. "Well," Jake said with a decisiveness that surprised him, "first things first. You both need food and rest. My ranch isn't much, but it's got a roof and a well, and I've got enough supplies to share." The offer was impulsive, but as soon as he spoke the words, he knew it was the right thing to do. Whatever complications this might bring, he cannot simply send them on their way to face more hardship and danger. Maria's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been relief. Senor Morrison, we could not impose on your hospitality. You have already done so much by protecting us from the crowd. We can continue our journey and find another way. Her polite refusal was clearly a matter of pride and proper upbringing, but Jake could see the exhaustion in both sisters' faces. It's not an imposition, Jake said firmly. It's what neighbors do for each other. And right now, we're neighbors who need to help each other out. He had made his decision, and something about the rightness of it settled his doubts. Whatever lay ahead, he would not abandon these young women to face it alone. Elena looked between her sister and Jake with obvious hope, her youth making it harder to maintain the polite distance that pride demanded. Maria, she said softly, perhaps we should accept Senor Morrison's kindness. Grandmother would want us to be safe. Her gentle persuasion carried the weight of practical necessity, and Jake could see Maria wavering. The elder sister studied Jake's face intently, as if trying to read his true intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. If you're certain we will not be a burden, we accept your generous offer. But only until we can find safe passage to San Carlos. We do not wish to put you in danger because of your kindness to us. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed all day. The only danger around here comes from narrow minds and hard hearts. And I've been dealing with those all my life. His words carried more truth than he had intended to reveal, but they seemed to reassure the sisters about his motivations. As they walked toward his horse, Jake found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. His simple life was about to become considerably more complicated, and he knew there would be consequences from the townspeople who had witnessed his defiance of their prejudices. But as he glanced at the two young women walking beside him, their dignity intact despite everything they had endured, he felt certain he had made the right choice. The ride back to his ranch was quiet, with Maria and Elena sharing his horse while he walked alongside, leading them toward an uncertain future that would test all of them in ways they could not yet imagine. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across a modest valley, its weathered buildings telling the story of years of hard work and careful maintenance. Jake's homestead consisted of a simple two-room cabin, a barn that had seen better days, and a collection of smaller outbuildings that served various purposes. It was not impressive by any standard, but it was clean, functional, and had the quality that mattered most to Maria and Elena after days of hostile rejection. It felt safe. As they approached the cabin, Jake found himself seeing his home through the eyes of his guests. The structure was solid, but plain, built by his own hands from local timber with whatever materials he could afford. The roof needed some attention, and the paint on the shutters had faded to almost nothing, but it had weathered many seasons and provided reliable shelter. A small garden plot near the house showed signs of recent attention, with neat rows of vegetables that would help stretch his limited resources through the winter months. It's not much, Jake said as he helped the sisters down from his horse, but it's honest shelter. His words carried a hint of apology for what he perceived as the humble nature of his home, but Maria and Elena looked at it with eyes that had learned to value substance over appearance. It is beautiful, Elena said softly, her voice carrying genuine appreciation. It looks like a home where people care for each other. Her observation surprised Jake, who had grown so accustomed to the solitary nature of his existence that he had forgotten how a home should feel when filled with human warmth and connection. Maria nodded in agreement, studying the neat arrangement of the buildings and the obvious pride Jake took in maintaining his property. You have built something good here, Senor Morrison. We can see that you work very hard. Her words carried the respect of someone who understood the value of honest labor, and Jake felt a flush of pleasure at her recognition. As they entered the cabin, Jake was acutely aware of how sparse his furnishings were. The main room contained a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that served for both heating and cooking, and shelves lined with a few books and essential supplies. The second room, barely large enough for a bed and a small dresser, constituted his private quarters. It was the home of a man who owned little but valued what he had. Please sit, Jake said, indicating the chairs while he moved toward the kitchen area. I'll get some food started. I know you must be hungry. He began pulling supplies from his limited stores, dried beans, some salt pork, flour that would make decent biscuits, and vegetables from his garden. It would be a simple meal, but hearty and nourishing. As Jake worked, he was surprised to see Maria rise and approach him. "Please, let us help. We are not guests who expect to be served. We wish to contribute what we can." Her offer was practical and sincere, reflecting both her upbringing and her understanding that they were not in a position to expect charity without offering something in return. "I can cook," Elena added shyly from her chair. The teachers at Carlisle insisted we learn all the domestic arts. They said it would make us more suitable for civilized society. The slight bitterness in her voice suggested that the school's lessons had come with a heavy cost in terms of cultural identity and personal autonomy. Jake found himself curious about their experiences at the famous Indian school, but he sensed that the topic carried painful associations. Instead, he gratefully accepted their help, and soon the three of them were working together to prepare a meal. The simple act of cooking together seemed to ease some of the tension that had characterized their first meeting, allowing them to begin the process of becoming acquainted as individuals rather than symbols of their respective backgrounds. As they worked, Maria shared pieces of their story. She and Elena were the daughters of an Apache warrior who had been killed in one of the final conflicts between their people and the U.S. Army. Their mother had died of illness during their first winter at Carlisle, leaving them with only their grandmother as remaining family. The school had become their world for nearly 8 years, teaching them English, Christianity, and the domestic skills deemed appropriate for young women of their circumstances. "They told us we were being prepared for useful lives," Maria explained as she skillfully shaped biscuit dough. But useful to whom was never entirely clear. "We learned to read and write, to sew and cook and keep house, but we also learned that the world outside the school would never accept us as equals, no matter how well we mastered their ways." Her words carried a wisdom born of harsh experience, the understanding that education alone could not overcome the deep-seated prejudices they faced. Elena's story emerged more slowly, in fragments shared while she carefully chopped vegetables with a knife that had clearly seen many meals prepared. She was 2 years younger than Maria, but had always been the more delicate of the sisters, sensitive to the cruelties they encountered and more deeply affected by their displacement from traditional Apache life. The school had been particularly hard on her, and Maria had spent much of their time there protecting her younger sister from both the institutional harshness and the cruelty of other students. When we received word that our grandmother was dying, Elena said quietly, the school officials were reluctant to let us go. They said our education was not complete, that we had not yet learned sufficient discipline of function in the outside world. The irony of being judged insufficiently civilized while demonstrating perfect manners and articulate speech was not lost on any of them. Jake found himself increasingly angry at the systematic cruelty these young women had faced, but he kept his feelings to himself, focusing instead on the practical matters of their immediate situation. As they sat down to eat their simple meal, he broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind since they left town. "I've been thinking about how to get you safely to San Carlos," he said between bites of surprisingly good stew. "The direct route would take you through some rough country, and there are plenty of folks along the way who might not be as understanding as they should be." His diplomatic phrasing barely concealed his concern about the very real dangers they would face traveling alone. Maria nodded soberly. "We have already encountered such people. The stage driver who abandoned us was quite clear about his feelings regarding Indians traveling through what he called white territory. We understand that the path will not be easy." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of this reality spoke to the resignation that came from a lifetime of such encounters. "There's another problem," Jake continued, setting down his spoon and meeting their eyes directly. "Word of what happened in town today will spread. Tom Bradley and Mrs. Henderson aren't the type to let things go, and there are others who might decide to take matters into their own hands. They might come looking for you, or they might try to cause trouble for me for helping you." The sisters exchanged a glance that spoke of their shared understanding of such dangers. They had lived their entire lives under the threat of violence from those who saw their very existence as an affront to the natural order. The possibility that their presence might bring harm to their protector clearly troubled them both. "Perhaps we should leave tonight," Elena suggested, her voice small but determined. "We do not wish to bring danger to someone who has shown us such kindness." Her willingness to sacrifice her own safety for his protection touched Jake deeply, reminding him of the fundamental decency that prejudice could not destroy. No, Jake said firmly. You're not going anywhere tonight or any other night until we figure out a safe way to get you where you need to go. I made a commitment when I stepped between you and that crowd, and I don't abandon my commitments. His words carried a conviction that surprised him with its intensity, as if speaking them had clarified something important about his own character. Maria studied his face carefully, and Jake had the sense that she was taking his measure in a way that went beyond simple gratitude for his help. "Senor Morrison," she said slowly, "why are you doing this? We are strangers to you, and as you have seen, helping us brings nothing but trouble. Most men in your position would have walked away from the confrontation in town if they had noticed it at all." The question caught Jake off guard, forcing him to examine motivations he had not fully understood himself. He thought of his sister Sarah, dead these 16 years, and of his own experiences as an outsider trying to build a life on the frontier. He thought of the loneliness that had become his constant companion, and of the way these two young women had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently dormant. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone in the world," he said finally. "Maybe because I was raised to believe that how you treat folks who can't help you says more about your character than anything else. Or maybe I'm just tired of watching good people get treated badly by folks who ought to know better." His honesty surprised them all, revealing more about his inner life than he typically shared with anyone. Elena smiled for the first time since they had met, an expression that transformed her face and revealed the spirited young woman that hardship had nearly concealed. "You are a good man, Senor Morrison. Our grandmother always told us that when the world seems darkest, the Creator sends someone to show us that light still exists. Perhaps you are that light for us." Her words carried a spiritual weight that made Jake uncomfortable, not because he rejected her sentiment, but because he felt unworthy of such trust. He was just a poor rancher trying to do the right thing, not some divinely appointed protector. But looking at the hope in both sisters' faces, he realized that whether he felt worthy or not, he had accepted a responsibility that would define not just their immediate future, but his own character going forward. As evening settled over the ranch, Jake found himself grappling with practical problems that seemed to multiply by the hour. The cabin had only one bed, which he insisted the sisters share while he made arrangements to sleep in the barn. Food supplies that had seemed adequate for one person would need to stretch to feed three, at least until he could make another trip to town for supplies. And underneath all these immediate concerns lay the larger question of how to ensure their safe passage to San Carlos without triggering the kind of violent confrontation that could endanger them all. The solution, when it came to him, was both simple and terrifying in its implications. As they sat around the fireplace that evening, sharing stories and getting to know each other as individuals rather than representatives of their respective backgrounds, Jake found himself studying Maria's face in the flickering light. She was beautiful, certainly, with the kind of classical features that would have made her the center of attention in any civilized drawing room. But more than that, she possessed a strength and intelligence that had allowed her to protect her sister and maintain her dignity despite years of institutional cruelty and social rejection. "I've been thinking about your situation," Jake said during a lull in their conversation, "and I think I might have an idea that could solve several problems at once." He paused, gathering his courage for what he was about to propose. "But it would require both of you to trust me completely, and it would mean taking a risk that could change all our lives forever." Maria leaned forward, her attention completely focused on his words. "What kind of risk, Senor Morrison?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty his statement had created. Jake took a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke his idea aloud, there would be no taking it back. "I think we should get married," he said simply. "You and me, Maria. A legal marriage, properly witnessed and recorded. It would give you the protection of my name, make you a respectable married woman that even the most prejudiced folks would have to think twice about harassing. And it would give Elena the protection of being your sister-in-law, part of a legitimate family unit." The silence that followed his proposal stretched long enough for Jake to begin regretting his impulsive suggestion. He had spoken without fully considering how his words might be received, driven by a combination of practical necessity and emotions he did not fully understand. The idea of marriage to a woman he barely knew should have seemed absurd, yet something about it felt profoundly right. Maria's face showed a complex mix of emotions, surprise, consideration, and something that might have been relief. Elena watched her sister anxiously, clearly understanding that this unexpected proposal might represent their best hope for safety and security. The weight of their desperate circumstances made Jake's offer seem less outrageous and more like a practical solution to an otherwise impossible situation. "You would do this for us?" Maria asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "You would tie yourself to a woman you barely know, accept the burden of caring for both of us, simply to keep us safe?" Her question carried undertones of disbelief, as if such generosity exceeded the bounds of what she thought possible from any man. "It wouldn't be a burden," Jake replied, surprised by the honesty of his own response. "These past few hours, having you both here, sharing meals and conversation, it's reminded me what it feels like to have a family. I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten how empty this place felt until today." His admission revealed a loneliness that went deeper than mere solitude, a fundamental hunger for human connection that he had suppressed for years. Elena reached over and took her sister's hand, her excitement barely contained. "Maria, it could work. As a married woman, you would have legal protection. The authorities would have to recognize your status, and even the people in town would have to treat you with more respect." Her practical mind had immediately grasped the advantages of Jake's proposal, seeing it as a path to the security that had eluded them for so long. But Maria's expression remained thoughtful, and Jake could see her weighing considerations that went beyond immediate safety. "Senor Morrison, Jake," she said, using his first name for the first time, "what you propose is generous beyond measure, but marriage is a sacred commitment. We barely know each other, and you deserve a wife who can offer you love, not just gratitude for your protection." Her words revealed the depth of her character, the refusal to accept even beneficial arrangements that might compromise his happiness or deceive him about her feelings. It was exactly the kind of honorable response Jake had come to expect from her, and it only strengthened his conviction that his proposal was the right course of action. "Maria," he said gently, "I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last 16 years alone on this ranch. I've made my peace with the idea that I'd probably never have a family of my own. But if there's a chance that we could build something together, even if it starts as an arrangement for practical reasons, wouldn't that be better than the alternative?" His words carried a vulnerability that surprised them all, revealing hopes he had barely admitted to himself. The conversation continued late into the evening, as they explored the implications and possibilities of Jake's unexpected proposal. Maria's concerns about entering into a marriage without love were met by Jake's patient assurance that respect and kindness provided a better foundation than many marriages enjoyed. Elena's enthusiasm for the plan was balanced by her sister's careful consideration of all the complications such an arrangement might create. As the fire burned low and they prepared to retire for the night, Maria finally gave her answer. Standing beside the dying embers, her face illuminated by the warm glow, she looked directly into Jake's eyes and spoke words that would change all their lives forever. "If you are truly certain about this proposal," she said with quiet dignity, "then I accept. But I want you to know that if I become your wife, I will honor that commitment completely. This will not be merely a marriage of convenience for me. It will be a sacred bond that I will respect and nurture as long as I live." Jake felt something shift in his chest as he heard her acceptance, a sense of rightness and completion that he had never expected to experience. Looking at the two sisters who would now become his family, he realized that his simple act of kindness in town had led to a transformation he never could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and complications, but tonight, for the first time in years, his home felt truly complete. Dawn broke over the Morrison Ranch with a clarity that seemed to reflect the momentous decisions of the previous evening. Jake woke in the barn loft, where he had spent a surprisingly restful night despite the unconventional sleeping arrangements. The prospect of the day ahead, traveling to town to arrange a marriage that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier, filled him with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that he had not experienced since his youth. Inside the cabin, Maria and Elena were already awake, quietly discussing the implications of the commitment Maria had made. The morning light streaming through the small windows revealed the careful way they had arranged their few possessions, treating Jake's home with the respect due to a place that might become permanently theirs. Elena's excitement about their changed circumstances was evident, but Maria's expression carried the weight of someone who understood the full gravity of what lay ahead. "Are you certain about this decision?" Elena asked her sister as they prepared a simple breakfast from Jake's stores. "Yesterday morning we were traveling alone to see our grandmother, and now you're planning to marry a man we met only hours ago. It seems like something from a fairy tale rather than real life." Maria's hands were steady as she worked, but her voice carried traces of the uncertainty she was struggling to overcome. "I am as certain as someone can be when facing such an unexpected choice," she replied carefully. "Jake Morrison is a good man who has shown us kindness when others showed only hatred. If this marriage can provide protection for us both and companionship for him, then perhaps it is a blessing rather than a desperate measure." Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's entrance, his hair still bearing traces of hay from his night in the barn. He carried fresh eggs from his small flock of chickens, a contribution to their breakfast that prompted smiles from both sisters. The simple domesticity of the moment, three people sharing morning tasks and planning their day together, felt both natural and surreal given the circumstances that had brought them together. "I've been thinking about the practical arrangements," Jake said as they sat down to eat. "We'll need to go to town today to speak with Reverend Patterson about performing the ceremony. He's a fair man, more concerned with Christian charity than social prejudice, so I think he'll agree to help us. We'll also need witnesses, and I know a couple of people who might be willing to stand with us despite what others might think." Maria nodded thoughtfully, appreciating his careful planning. "What about the legal requirements? Will the authorities accept a marriage between a white rancher and an Apache woman, even with proper documentation?" Her question revealed her understanding of the complex legal status that Native Americans occupied in territorial society, where rights and recognition could vary dramatically depending on circumstances and local prejudices. Arizona Territory recognizes marriages performed by ordained ministers, regardless of the participants' backgrounds. Jake explained, "There might be people who don't like it, but they'll have to respect it. And once we're legally married, you'll have all the rights and protections that come with being my wife." His confidence in the legal aspects of their plan helped ease some of Maria's concerns, though they all knew that social acceptance would be another matter entirely. Elena's practical nature emerged as she considered the immediate logistics. "What should we do about our journey to San Carlos? Our grandmother is still ill, and we had hoped to reach her soon." Her worry about their grandmother was evident, adding another layer of urgency to decisions that were already complex enough. Jake had been wrestling with this very question since Maria accepted his proposal. "I think we should send word to your grandmother about what's happened here, let her know that you're safe, and that we'll visit as soon as we can arrange it properly. A married woman traveling with her husband will face far fewer difficulties than two Apache girls traveling alone. We can make the journey together once we've had time to establish our new situation." The wisdom of this approach was clear to all of them, though Elena's disappointment at the delay was obvious. Maria reached across the table to take her sister's hand, offering the kind of comfort and reassurance that spoke to their deep bond. "Grandmother is strong, Elena. She has survived much worse than illness, and she will understand that we are finally safe. That news alone might be the best medicine we can give her." As they prepared for the journey to town, Jake found himself acutely aware of how dramatically his life was about to change. The solitary existence that had defined his adult years was giving way to something entirely new and unpredictable. The prospect frightened him less than he had expected, perhaps because the loneliness that had become his constant companion made almost any change seem preferable to the status quo. The ride to Copper Ridge was tense with anticipation. Maria rode behind Jake on his horse, her arms around his waist in a gesture that felt both practical and intimate. Elena rode their pack horse, her bright eyes taking in the landscape with the curiosity of someone who might soon call this place home. They all understood that the reception they received in town would set the tone for their future together, determining whether they would find acceptance or face ongoing hostility. As they approached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, they could see that word of the previous day's events had indeed spread throughout the community. Small groups of townspeople stood in animated conversation, their discussions clearly centered on the strange development of a local rancher protecting Apache women. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval, and a few displayed the kind of anger that suggested more serious opposition might be forthcoming. Their first stop was the modest home that served as Reverend Patterson's residence and unofficial office. The minister was a man in his 50s, worn thin by years of trying to bring Christian values to a frontier community that often found such ideals inconvenient. His weathered face showed surprise when he saw Jake's companions, but his greeting was cordial, if reserved. "Jake Morrison," the Reverend said, stepping onto his porch to meet them. "I heard there was some excitement in town yesterday involving you and these young ladies. I hope everyone is well and that no lasting damage was done." His diplomatic phrasing suggested he had heard multiple versions of events, each colored by the teller's own prejudices and assumptions. "Reverend Patterson," Jake replied, dismounting and helping Maria down from the horse. "I'd like you to meet Maria and Elena. They've been traveling to visit their grandmother at San Carlos, and they needed assistance when some folks in town weren't very welcoming." His carefully neutral description of the previous day's confrontation was designed to avoid inflaming any prejudices the minister might harbor while establishing the sisters' legitimate purpose for being in the area. The Reverend nodded politely to both women, his years of ministerial training allowing him to maintain appropriate courtesy despite any personal reservations he might have felt. "Ladies, I trust you were not seriously mistreated by anyone in our community. While frontier life sometimes brings out the worst in people, we strive to maintain Christian principles of hospitality and kindness toward all travelers." "We were treated kindly by Senor Morrison," Maria replied diplomatically, "and we understand that fear sometimes causes good people to act in ways they might later regret. We harbor no ill will toward your community." Her gracious response demonstrated the diplomatic skills that 8 years at Carlisle had taught her, deflecting potential conflict while maintaining her dignity. Jake took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the true purpose of their visit. "Reverend, I came to ask if you would perform a marriage ceremony for Maria and myself. We've decided that we want to build a life together, and we'd like to have our union blessed by the church and recognized by the community." His request was delivered with as much confidence as he could muster, though he was prepared for surprise or even refusal. The minister's eyebrows rose sharply, his surprise evident despite his efforts to maintain clerical composure. "Marriage? Jake, this is quite sudden, isn't it? You've known this young woman for how long?" His question carried both pastoral concern and an undertone of social disapproval that he was trying to suppress. "Long enough to know that she's a good woman who deserves respect and protection," Jake replied firmly. "And long enough to know that I want to share my life with her." Sometimes the heart recognizes truth faster than the mind can calculate all the practical considerations. His romantic phrasing was somewhat at odds with the practical nature of their arrangement, but he knew that appeals to emotion would carry more weight with a minister than purely logical arguments. Reverend Patterson studied Maria carefully, taking in her composed demeanor and refined speech. Her education and obvious intelligence made it harder for him to dismiss the proposed union as mere folly or temporary infatuation. "Miss Maria, is this marriage truly your desire? You're not being coerced or pressured into this arrangement." His question addressed the legitimate concern that such hasty proposals might not represent the woman's free choice. "Reverend Patterson," Maria replied with quiet dignity, "I accept Mr. Morrison's proposal freely and with full understanding of the commitment I am making. He is a good man who has shown me kindness when others showed only hatred. I believe we can build a strong marriage based on mutual respect and shared values." Her words carried conviction without revealing the desperate circumstances that had prompted Jake's proposal. Elena stepped forward, adding her voice to the conversation. "Reverend, my sister has always been wise beyond her years. She would not make such a decision lightly. Mr. Morrison has shown himself to be a man of honor, and I believe this marriage will bring happiness to them both." Her enthusiastic endorsement carried weight precisely because it came from someone who clearly cared deeply about Maria's welfare. The minister was silent for several long moments, clearly wrestling with competing impulses. His Christian duty to support marriage and family was at odds with social pressures that discouraged unions between whites and Native Americans. Finally, his pastoral instincts prevailed over social conformity. "Very well," he said slowly. "If you are both certain about this decision, I will perform the ceremony. Marriage is a sacred institution that should be available to all of God's children, regardless of their earthly circumstances." His agreement came with the kind of moral authority that made it clear he would not be swayed by whatever criticism might follow. The practical arrangements for the ceremony proceeded quickly once the Reverend's agreement was secured. Jake suggested they hold the service that very afternoon, reasoning that delay would only provide more time for opposition to organize. They would need witnesses, and Jake knew exactly who to ask: Tom Brennan, an Irish immigrant who had helped Jake build his cabin, and Sarah Mitchell, a widow who had always treated Jake with kindness despite his modest circumstances. As word spread through town about the impending marriage, reactions varied dramatically. Some townspeople expressed quiet approval for Jake's willingness to help people in need, seeing his actions as embodying the frontier spirit of mutual aid. Others were scandalized by what they viewed as a betrayal of racial boundaries, and their disapproval was vocal and vehement. By midday, it was clear that the entire community was divided over events that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. Tom Brennan's response to Jake's request was characteristically direct. "Jake Morrison," the burly Irishman said with a grin, "you've got more courage than sense, but I've never known you to do anything without good reason. If you want to marry this girl, then by God, you'll have my support and my witness." His acceptance came without hesitation, reflecting both his friendship with Jake and his own experience as an outsider who had faced prejudice in his adopted homeland. Sarah Mitchell's reaction was more complex, colored by her understanding of the social dynamics that would affect the marriage. "Jake, dear," she said gently, "I admire your kindness, but have you thought about what this will mean for all of you? This community can be harsh toward those who don't conform to expectations, and marriage won't shield you from all of that hostility." Her concern came from genuine affection and a realistic assessment of the challenges they would face. "Sarah," Jake replied, "I've spent 16 years trying to conform to other people's expectations, and all it's brought me is loneliness. Maybe it's time I started living according to my own conscience instead of worrying about what the neighbors think." His words carried a resolution that surprised them both, revealing a determination that had been building for years beneath his quiet exterior. The ceremony itself was arranged for late afternoon in the small church that served Copper Ridge's spiritual needs. Word of the event had spread throughout the community, and as the hour approached, it became clear that the wedding would draw an audience far beyond the immediate participants. Some came out of curiosity, others to show support, and still others to voice their opposition to what they saw as an inappropriate union. As Maria prepared for her wedding in Sarah Mitchell's home, Elena helped her sister arrange her hair and adjust the simple white dress that Sarah had graciously provided. The garment had belonged to Sarah's own daughter, who had died young, and its loan carried symbolic weight that was not lost on any of them. In providing this tangible support, Sarah was making a statement about her acceptance of the marriage that would resonate throughout the community. "You look beautiful," Elena said softly as she fastened the small buttons at the back of Maria's dress. "And you look happy despite everything that has happened. Are you truly at peace with this decision?" Her question reflected her own need for reassurance that her sister was not sacrificing her happiness for practical necessity. Maria studied her reflection in Sarah's small mirror, seeing not just her own face, but the culmination of a journey that had begun with their desperate flight from Carlisle. "I'm more at peace than I have been in years," she said truthfully. "For the first time since our parents died, I feel like we might have found a place where we belong. Jake Morrison may not love me yet, but he respects me, and that is more than I dared hope for when we started this journey." Meanwhile, at the church, Jake stood with Reverend Patterson and Tom Brennan, watching as townspeople filed into the small building. The mix of expressions on their faces told the story of a community grappling with changing times and competing values. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row with her arms crossed and her mouth set in disapproving lines, while other faces showed curiosity, acceptance, or open hostility. "You ready for this, Jake?" Tom asked quietly, noting the tension in his friend's posture. "Once you say those vows, there's no going back to the way things were before." His words carried both warning and encouragement, acknowledging the magnitude of the step Jake was about to take. "I've been ready for longer than I realized," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Maybe this isn't the life I planned, but it feels like the life I'm supposed to have." As he spoke these words, he caught sight of Maria entering the church on Sarah Mitchell's arm, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was making the right choice. The ceremony that followed was simple but profoundly moving, binding together 3 lives that had been forever changed by a moment of moral courage in the face of injustice. As Jake and Maria exchanged vows in front of the divided community, they created something new and unprecedented, a family built on respect, compassion, and the radical belief that love could transcend the boundaries that society sought to impose. The weeks following Jake and Maria's wedding brought changes to the Morrison Ranch that none of them could have anticipated. What had begun as a marriage of convenience was slowly transforming into something deeper and more meaningful, though the path was neither smooth nor predictable. The simple addition of two women to Jake's solitary existence had created a dynamic household where new routines had to be established and old assumptions challenged daily. Maria approached her role as Jake's wife with the same dignity and determination she had shown throughout their ordeal. She took charge of the household management with efficiency that impressed Jake, transforming his bachelor quarters into a proper home. Her education at Carlisle had taught her the domestic skills that territorial society valued in wives. But she brought to these tasks a creativity and attention to detail that reflected her own personality rather than merely following institutional training. Elena's presence added a different energy to their new family structure. At 17, she possessed a youthful optimism that had somehow survived the hardships of their journey. And she threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm that surprised them all. Her quick mind and natural curiosity led her to master new skills rapidly, from caring for livestock to maintaining the garden that provided much of their fresh food. Her laughter, which had been absent during the dark days of their travel, gradually returned to brighten their modest home. Jake found himself adjusting to married life with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. Having spent so many years alone, the constant presence of his wife and sister-in-law required significant changes in his daily habits and thinking. But these adjustments brought compensating benefits that grew more apparent with each passing day. The house felt warm and alive in ways that went beyond mere physical comfort, filled with conversation, shared meals, and the kind of small daily interactions that create the texture of family life. The relationship between Jake and Maria evolved gradually, built on daily acts of consideration and growing mutual respect. They shared the same bed, but maintained careful boundaries, both understanding that trust and affection could not be rushed despite the legal nature of their union. Jake's natural gentleness and Maria's thoughtful nature created an atmosphere where intimacy could develop naturally, without pressure or artificial expectations. Their first real test came when Mrs. Henderson arrived at the ranch one morning. Her face set in lines of moral outrage that had become her permanent expression since the wedding. She brought with her two other ladies from town, their purpose clearly to confront what they saw as an affront to community standards. Jake was working in the barn when they arrived, leaving Maria to face their disapproval alone. Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Henderson said, her use of Maria's married name carrying deliberate scorn. "We've come to discuss the situation you've created in our community. Your presence here has caused considerable disturbance among decent Christian people, and we feel something must be done to address it." Her words carried the implied authority of someone who had appointed herself spokesperson for proper society. Maria faced the three women with calm composure, though her hands betrayed slight nervousness as she smoothed her apron. "Ladies, I'm sorry to hear that my marriage has caused disturbance. My husband and I have tried to live quietly and respectfully, bothering no one. Perhaps you could help me understand what specific concerns you have." Her diplomatic response was designed to force them to state their prejudices explicitly rather than hiding behind vague claims of community standards. "Specific concerns?" Mrs. Henderson's voice rose sharply. "You're an Apache woman living as wife to a white man in our community. That alone is enough to corrupt the moral foundation of everything decent people have worked to build here. Your very presence encourages other Indians to think they can ignore the proper boundaries between the races." The other women nodded in agreement, their faces showing the kind of self-righteous certainty that makes reasoned discussion impossible. Maria recognized the futility of attempting to address their fundamental assumptions, but she also understood the importance of responding with dignity rather than allowing their hostility to go unchallenged. "I see," Maria said quietly. "And what exactly do you propose should be done about this situation?" "My marriage to Mr. Morrison was performed by your own minister and witnessed by members of your community. We have broken no laws and harm no one. We simply wish to live peacefully as husband and wife." Her calm recitation of facts was intended to force them to reveal the true nature of their objections. The arrival of Jake from the barn changed the dynamic of the confrontation significantly. His presence immediately shifted the balance of power, as the women found themselves facing not just an Apache woman they could intimidate, but a white man whose rights and status they could not dismiss so easily. His expression as he took in the scene made it clear that he understood exactly what was happening. "Mrs. Henderson," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning that stopped her mid-sentence. "I assume you have some important business with my wife that requires you to come onto my property and upset her while I'm working." His phrasing made it clear that he considered their visit an intrusion and their treatment of Maria unacceptable. "Jake Morrison," Mrs. Henderson replied, drawing herself up to her full height. "We're here as representatives of the decent people of Copper Ridge to express our concerns about this arrangement you've entered into. This marriage is an affront to Christian values and civilized society, and it cannot be allowed to continue without consequences." Jake's expression hardened as he heard the implicit threat in her words. "And what consequences might those be, Mrs. Henderson? Are you threatening my wife? Because if you are, I should remind you that threatening a man's family on his own property is generally considered poor form, even in a frontier community like ours." His words carried a steel that surprised the women, who had apparently expected him to be more amenable to their pressure. The confrontation might have escalated further if Elena had not appeared from the garden, her arms full of fresh vegetables and her face bright with innocent curiosity. Her youth and obvious good nature provided a stark contrast to the hostility of the visiting women, highlighting the absurdity of treating these two sisters as threats to community welfare. "Maria," Elena called cheerfully, "should I start preparing lunch for everyone? We have plenty of fresh corn and tomatoes, and I could make that bread you taught me yesterday." Her offer of hospitality to people who had come to harass them demonstrated the kind of grace under pressure that made their critics' positions seem even more unreasonable. The visiting women found themselves in the awkward position of being offered refreshment by the very people they had come to condemn. Their discomfort with this role reversal was evident as they struggled to maintain their moral authority while being treated with kindness they had not shown in return. Mrs. Henderson's certainty began to waver as she was forced to confront the reality that these supposed threats to civilization were actually generous, well-mannered people who were offering her food. "We didn't come here for social visiting," Mrs. Henderson said stiffly, though her tone had lost some of its earlier venom. "We came to make our position clear regarding this inappropriate situation. The decent people of Copper Ridge will not stand by and watch our community be corrupted by this kind of mixing." Her struggle to find appropriate words for her objections revealed the fundamental irrationality of her position. Jake stepped closer to Maria, his protective instincts fully engaged. "Let me make our position clear, Mrs. Henderson. Maria is my wife, legally married in your own church by your own minister. Elena is my sister-in-law and a member of my household. They are both under my protection, and anyone who threatens or harasses them will answer to me personally. I suggest you remember that when you're discussing this situation with other members of the community." The unmistakable warning in his words had the desired effect on the visiting women, who suddenly remembered that frontier justice often operated outside formal legal channels. Jake Morrison might be a quiet man, but he was also known to be capable and determined when protecting what mattered to him. Their moral crusade seemed less appealing when confronted with the possibility of actual consequences for their actions. As the women prepared to leave, their mission clearly unsuccessful, Mrs. Henderson made one final attempt to salvage her position. "This isn't over, Jake Morrison. There are others in town who share our concerns, and they may not be as reasonable as we've been today. You'd be wise to consider the safety of these women you're so determined to protect." Jake's response was delivered with quiet intensity that made even Maria shiver slightly. "Mrs. Henderson, if anyone in this community threatens or harms my family, they'll discover that I take such threats very seriously indeed. I've been patient with ignorance and prejudice, but my patience has limits. I suggest you share that information with anyone who might be considering taking matters into their own hands." After the women left, the incident's aftermath revealed how much the three of them had come to depend on each other for emotional support. Elena was shaken by the encounter, having been somewhat sheltered from the worst of the community's hostility by her youth and her sister's protection. Maria felt guilty that her presence had brought such trouble to Jake, despite his repeated assurances that he regretted nothing about their marriage. Jake found himself more affected by the confrontation than he had expected. The implicit threats against his family had awakened protective instincts that surprised him with their intensity. He had not fully realized how much these two women had come to mean to him until he was forced to defend them against people who wanted to destroy their happiness simply because it challenged social conventions. That evening, as they sat around their fireplace discussing the day's events, Jake made a decision that would define their future relationship. "I want you both to know that what happened today changes nothing about our situation here," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "This is our home. You are my family. And no amount of pressure from narrow-minded people will change that. We're going to build something good here together, regardless of what others think about it." Maria's response revealed how much the encounter had affected her despite her outward composure. "Jake, I never wanted to bring trouble to your life. Perhaps Elena and I should continue our journey to San Carlos, visit our grandmother, and then find somewhere else to settle. You've done more than enough to help us, and you don't deserve to face ongoing hostility because of your kindness." "Maria Morrison," Jake said firmly, using her married name with deliberate emphasis. "You're my wife, and this is your home. We made vows to each other, and I intend to honor them completely. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "this place has never felt more like home than it does now, with both of you here. I'm not giving that up because some people can't adjust to changing times." Elena's contribution to the conversation revealed her growing maturity and understanding of their situation. "We could face this kind of opposition anywhere we go," she said thoughtfully. "At least here we have each other, and we have friends like Tom Brennan and Sarah Mitchell who support us. Running away would just mean starting over in a new place where we know no one and have no protection." Their discussion continued late into the evening, strengthening the bonds between them and clarifying their commitment to making their unconventional family work despite external pressures. By the time they retired for the night, all three understood that they had crossed a threshold in their relationship, moving from an arrangement of mutual convenience to a genuine family unit that would defend itself against all challenges. The next morning brought news that would test their resolve in ways they could not have anticipated. Tom Brennan arrived at dawn with information that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. His usually cheerful face was grim as he dismounted and approached the house where Jake was already beginning his daily chores. "Jake," Tom said without preamble, "we need to talk. There are things happening in town that you need to know about, and they affect your family directly." His serious tone immediately caught Jake's attention, and he called for Maria and Elena to join them. Whatever Tom had learned was important enough to require all of them to hear it together. As they gathered on the porch, Tom delivered news that would force them to confront dangers they had hoped to avoid. "There's a group of men in town who aren't satisfied with just complaining about your marriage. They've been meeting quietly, talking about taking action to restore proper order to the community. Yesterday's visit from the ladies was apparently just the beginning of a more organized campaign against you." The implications of this information were immediately clear to all of them. They were no longer dealing with social disapproval or isolated incidents of harassment, but with a coordinated effort that could escalate to serious violence. The protection that Jake's name and legal marriage provided had limits, and they were about to discover what those limits were. The organized opposition that Tom Brennan warned them about materialized sooner than anyone expected. 3 nights after his visit, Jake was awakened by the sound of horses approaching his ranch in the darkness. Through the window, he could see torches bobbing in the distance, their flickering light revealing the silhouettes of approximately a dozen mounted men. His blood ran cold as he realized that the threats Mrs. Henderson had hinted at were about to become reality. "Maria," he whispered urgently, gently shaking his wife awake. "Wake Elena, and both of you get dressed quickly. We have trouble coming." His calm voice belied the fear coursing through him as he grabbed his rifle from beside the bed and began checking his ammunition. He had hoped that reason would eventually prevail in the community, but the approaching rider suggested that some people had moved beyond reason to direct action. The sisters responded with the efficiency of people who had learned to react quickly to danger. Within minutes, they were dressed and alert, understanding without explanation that their safety was about to be seriously threatened. Elena clutched the small bundle of their few possessions, while Maria's face showed the kind of determined composure that Jake had come to admire and depend upon during their brief marriage. Through the window, they could see the riders forming a loose circle around the cabin, their torches creating an ominous ring of light in the darkness. A voice called out from the group, demanding that Jake show himself and bring the Apache women with him. The speaker was Tom Bradley, the blacksmith whose hostility had been evident from their first encounter in town, and his tone left no doubt about the violent nature of his intentions. "Jake Morrison," Bradley shouted, "you've brought shame on this community long enough. It's time to set things right and send these savages back where they belong. Come out peacefully and hand them over, and maybe we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." The false reasonableness of his words couldn't disguise the underlying threat, and Jake knew that compliance would likely mean death for Maria and Elena. Jake positioned himself at the window with his rifle, while motioning for the sisters to stay low and out of sight. His military experience during the Indian Wars had taught him that negotiations with an armed mob were rarely productive, but he needed to buy time to assess their situation and plan their response. The cabin's solid construction would provide some protection, but they were outnumbered and surrounded with limited ammunition. "Bradley," Jake called back, "these women are under my protection, and they're not going anywhere. You and your friends need to leave my property immediately before this situation gets out of hand." His response was firm but not inflammatory, designed to avoid escalating the confrontation while making his position absolutely clear. The reply came in the form of derisive laughter from multiple voices, followed by Bradley's more aggressive tone. "Your property? Morrison, you've forgotten what you are and where you belong. No white man in his right mind protects Apache over his own people. You've been bewitched or corrupted, and we're here to cure you of that sickness." His words revealed the twisted logic that allowed otherwise decent people to justify violence against innocent individuals. A new voice joined the conversation, one that chilled Jake to the bone. Sheriff Williams had apparently joined the mob, lending official sanction to what was essentially an act of vigilante terrorism. "Jake," the sheriff called, "I'm here in my official capacity to maintain order. These men have legitimate concerns about the safety of the community, and I think it would be best if you cooperated with their reasonable requests." The betrayal inherent in the sheriff's words struck Jake like a physical blow. The law that should have protected his family was instead siding with those who threatened them, turning his legal marriage into a meaningless piece of paper when confronted with community prejudice. He realized that they were truly on their own, with no hope of official protection or legal recourse. Maria appeared at his side, her face pale but resolute. "Jake, perhaps Elena, and I should surrender ourselves to prevent violence. We never intended to bring such danger to you, and we cannot bear the thought that you might be hurt because of your kindness to us." Her willingness to sacrifice herself for his safety moved him deeply, but also strengthened his resolve to protect her at any cost. "Maria Morrison," Jake said firmly, using her married name with deliberate emphasis, "you are my wife, and Elena is my sister-in-law. I took vows to protect and honor you, and no mob of cowards is going to make me break those vows. We're family, and families stick together no matter what." His words carried a conviction that surprised them all, revealing how completely he had embraced his role as their protector and partner. Elena's voice came from the darkness behind them, carrying a strength that belied her 17 years. "If we're going to fight, then we fight together. I won't hide while my sister and her husband defend our home." Her unexpected courage added another dimension to their desperate situation, transforming their defense from Jake's solitary stand into a family's united resistance against injustice. The standoff continued for several tense hours, with the mob maintaining their circle while making increasingly threatening demands. As dawn approached, Jake realized that their situation was becoming more desperate rather than improving. The attackers had time and numbers on their side, while he had limited ammunition and no prospect of help from outside sources. Something had to break soon, and he feared it would not be in their favor. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Just as Bradley was organizing his men for a direct assault on the cabin, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of additional riders. But these newcomers were not reinforcements for the mob. They were Tom Brennan leading a group of men who had come to defend Jake's family against the vigilante attack. "That's far enough, Bradley." Tom's voice boomed across the pre-dawn darkness. "You and your friends are trespassing on Jake Morrison's property and threatening a lawfully married couple. I suggest you reconsider your actions before this gets seriously out of hand." The Irish immigrant's arrival with backup transformed the tactical situation, evening the odds and giving the attackers reason to pause. Among Tom's companions, Jake was surprised and gratified to see several men he had not expected to support him. There was Miguel Santos, a Mexican rancher who had faced his own share of prejudice; James Crawford, a former soldier who understood the meaning of honor; and even old Pete Wilson, whose judgment was respected throughout the community despite his unconventional views on social issues. Sheriff Williams found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the two groups faced each other in the growing light. His official authority meant nothing when confronted with armed men defending their neighbors against mob violence. And his earlier cooperation with Bradley's group now looked like a serious error in judgment rather than legitimate law enforcement. "Sheriff," Tom called out, "I think it's time you remembered your oath to protect all citizens of this territory, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. These people have broken no laws and threatened no one. If you can't do your job properly, maybe it's time for someone else to wear that badge." The challenge was direct and public, forcing Williams to choose between his prejudices and his official responsibilities. Bradley's group began to waver as they realized that their anticipated easy victory had turned into a potentially costly confrontation with armed neighbors who were prepared to fight. The moral certainty that had driven them to surround Jake's cabin dissolved when faced with opposition from people they respected, forcing them to confront the possibility that their actions might be wrong rather than righteous. As the standoff continued into full daylight, Maria made a decision that would ultimately resolve the crisis in their favor. She opened the cabin door and stepped outside, her dignity intact despite the circumstances, addressing both groups with the kind of moral authority that comes from absolute sincerity. "Gentlemen," she said, her clear voice carrying across the tense gathering, "I am Maria Morrison, and I want all of you to understand something important. My husband and I chose each other freely, with full knowledge of the challenges we would face. We have harmed no one, broken no laws, and asked nothing from this community except the basic respect due to any married couple. If you cannot find it in your hearts to accept our union, then at least have the decency to leave us in peace." Her words carried a power that surprised everyone present, including Maria herself. The simple dignity of her statement, combined with her obvious education and refinement, made it impossible for reasonable people to continue viewing her as a threat to civilization. Even some of Bradley's supporters began to shift uncomfortably, their certainty undermined by the reality of the woman they had come to intimidate. Elena joined her sister outside, adding her own voice to Maria's appeal. "We are not the enemies you imagine us to be. We are simply two women who found refuge with a good man when the world showed us nothing but hatred. If you cannot understand love that crosses the boundaries others have created, then perhaps you should ask yourselves what kind of people you are becoming in the name of defending your community." The confrontation's resolution came gradually rather than dramatically, as individual members of Bradley's group began to question their participation in what was clearly becoming an indefensible action. The moral courage shown by Maria and Elena, combined with the armed support provided by Tom and his allies, created a situation where continued aggression required a level of commitment that most of the attackers were unwilling to make. Sheriff Williams, recognizing the shifting dynamics of the situation, finally chose to fulfill his official duties rather than maintain his earlier cooperation with the vigilantes. "All right, everyone needs to disperse peacefully," he announced with renewed authority. "This gathering is unlawful, and anyone who doesn't leave immediately will be subject to arrest." His belated assertion of legal order provided face-saving cover for Bradley's followers to withdraw without admitting the wrongness of their actions. As the mob gradually dispersed, Jake felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with the realization that their trials were far from over. They had survived this immediate threat, but the underlying tensions that had created it remained unchanged. The community was still divided, and there would always be those who viewed their marriage as an affront to natural order that required correction. Tom Brennan approached the cabin as the last of the attackers rode away, his weathered face showing both satisfaction at their victory and concern for what might come next. "You handled that well, Jake," he said, extending his hand to his friend. "But I don't think this is the end of it. Bradley and his friends won't forget being embarrassed like this, and they'll be looking for other ways to cause trouble." Maria stepped forward to address Tom and his supporters, her gratitude evident despite her composed demeanor. "We cannot adequately express our appreciation for what you've done today. You risked your own safety to protect people you barely know, and we will never forget such generosity." Her words carried the kind of dignity that made their critics' positions seem even more unreasonable. Miguel Santos, his own experience with prejudice evident in his understanding expression, nodded respectfully to Maria. "Senora Morrison, in my country we have a saying, La familia que se defiende unida, permanece unida. The family that defends itself together remains together. You have shown today that you are truly a family, and that is something worth defending." The crisis had indeed transformed Jake, Maria, and Elena from a marriage of convenience into a genuine family unit. The shared danger had forced them to depend on each other completely, breaking down the careful boundaries they had maintained and creating bonds that went far beyond legal obligations or practical arrangements. They had chosen to face potential death together rather than abandon each other to mob violence. In the days that followed their confrontation with Bradley's group, the Morrison family found themselves occupying a unique position in the community. They were no longer welcome in certain establishments or social circles, but they had also gained the respect and active support of people who admired their courage and principled stand. The community had divided into clear camps regarding their presence, ending the uncertain neutrality that had characterized earlier attitudes. Their relationship with each other continued to deepen as they worked together to rebuild their sense of security and plan for their future. Jake and Maria's marriage evolved from respectful cooperation to genuine affection, built on shared trials and mutual admiration for each other's character. Elena found her place as both sister and valued family member, contributing her own strengths to their collective resilience. The question of visiting their grandmother at San Carlos was finally resolved when Jake announced his intention to make the journey with them as a family expedition rather than allowing them to travel alone. "We're going together," he stated firmly, "and we're going as the Morrison family. Your grandmother deserves to meet her new son-in-law, and I want to assure her personally that her granddaughters are safe and happy." The journey to San Carlos proved to be a revelation for all of them. Jake's presence provided protection from the hostility they might otherwise have encountered, while Maria and Elena served as guides through territory they knew from childhood stories and cultural memory. Elena's excitement at the prospect of seeing their grandmother grew with each mile, while Maria felt a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety about how their elderly relative would receive news of her hasty marriage. Their grandmother, whose Apache name translated roughly to Wise Moon, proved to be a remarkable woman whose age had only sharpened her intelligence and deepened her wisdom. Despite being confined to bed by illness, her eyes remained bright with curiosity and humor as she studied Jake carefully during their introduction. Her questions about his intentions and character were direct and probing, reflecting a lifetime of experience that had taught her to judge people by their actions rather than their words. "So you are the man who protected my granddaughters from those who would harm them," she said in carefully pronounced English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Tell me, why did you risk yourself for strangers? What did you hope to gain from such kindness?" Her question went to the heart of Jake's motivations in a way that forced him to examine his own reasons more deeply than he had before. Jake's answer came from a place of honesty that surprised him with its clarity. "I saw two good people being treated badly by folks who should have known better, and I couldn't walk away from that. I didn't know it would lead to marriage or family, but I've never regretted the choice to help them. They've brought more happiness to my life than I thought possible." Wise Moon listened carefully to his words, then turned her attention to Maria with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her granddaughter's heart. "And you, child? Do you find happiness with this man who gave you his protection and his name? Does your heart tell you that you have chosen well?" Her question addressed the fundamental issue that everyone had been wondering about, but no one had directly asked. Maria's response revealed how much her feelings had evolved since that desperate morning in Copper Ridge. "Grandmother, I have found more than protection with Jake Morrison. I have found respect, kindness, and the possibility of love that grows stronger each day. He has given us not just safety, but a home where we can be ourselves without fear or shame." Her words carried the ring of absolute truth, confirming that their marriage had transcended its practical origins. Elena's reunion with their grandmother was emotional and healing, providing closure to the journey that had begun with such desperation weeks earlier. The old woman's illness proved to be less severe than they had feared, and the joy of seeing her granddaughter safe and settled seemed to accelerate her recovery. Her blessing of their unconventional family arrangement carried weight that went beyond mere approval, representing acceptance from the elder generation that legitimized their choices. The week they spent at San Carlos allowed Jake to understand more about his wife's cultural background and the forces that had shaped her character. He met other members of their extended family and learned about traditions that had survived despite efforts to erase them through forced assimilation. This cultural education deepened his appreciation for Maria's strength and resilience while helping him understand the losses she had endured. Their return to the Morrison Ranch marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. They were no longer refugees seeking safety or strangers bound by convenience, but a genuine family that had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger. The ranch itself seemed to reflect this transformation, as Maria's touches and Elena's energy had turned Jake's functional homestead into a place that truly felt like home. The community's reaction to their return was mixed, but generally more accepting than it had been before their departure. The dramatic confrontation with Bradley's mob had clarified positions and forced people to choose sides, eliminating the uncertain hostility that had characterized earlier attitudes. Those who supported them did so openly, while their opponents maintained a sullen distance that was preferable to active harassment. As autumn approached, and they prepared for their first winter together as a family, Jake reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this point. A simple act of moral courage in defending two strangers had led to a complete transformation of his life, bringing him the family he had never expected to have and the happiness he had stopped believing was possible. Maria's pregnancy, announced on a crisp October morning, seemed to seal their transformation from convenient arrangement to genuine family. The prospect of a child who would represent the blending of their backgrounds and the continuation of their unlikely love story filled them all with excitement and hope for the future. Even Elena's tears of joy reflected her understanding that their family was not only surviving, but growing stronger. The baby's arrival the following spring brought recognition from the community that could not be denied or withdrawn. Whatever people thought about the unconventional nature of the Morrison family's origins, the sight of Jake cradling his infant son while Maria and Elena fussed over their newest family member represented something fundamental about love, commitment, and the creation of new life that transcended racial boundaries. Years later, as their family continued to grow and prosper, Jake would often think about that morning in Copper Ridge when he had made a choice that changed everything. His decision to protect two Apache women from mob hatred had been motivated by simple decency, but it had led to blessings he could never have imagined. In giving Maria and Elena his name and protection, he had discovered that he was actually the one being rescued from loneliness, purposelessness, and the narrow thinking that limited so many others in their community. The Morrison family became living proof that love could indeed transcend the boundaries that society sought to impose, and that courage in the face of injustice could create something beautiful and enduring. Their story spread throughout the territory, inspiring others to question their assumptions and demonstrating that the American frontier was large enough to accommodate all kinds of love and family arrangements for those brave enough to defend them.